Often, we start with the assumption that everyone understands the rules. We think that if we are logical, open, and consistent, others will respond in the same way. This idea seems obvious, so we rarely question it. This is precisely where the problem lies. We end up in situations where one side believes in fairness, but the other side is figuring out how to use that belief against them. In the late 1970s, psychologist Morton Deutsch studied cooperation and competition using simulated negotiation games. Participants who thought the game was about cooperation kept sharing details even after the other side started taking advantage of them. Deutsch was surprised not just by the betrayal, but by how long it took people to react. They noticed the unfairness early on, but they tried to excuse it. They assumed it was due to misunderstanding, bad luck, or simple mistakes. They looked for harmless reasons because accepting that others had bad intentions felt more risky than losing out. I didn't expect how strong this tendency was. Even when money was on the line, people held onto the idea that things would eventually even out. This happens frequently outside of controlled studies. In the early 2000s, internal record from Enron showed that employees noticed problems years before the company collapsed. The numbers did not match. The incentive seemed wrong. Even so, many stayed silent or worked harder. In later interviews, they said they believed that if they kept acting honestly, the system would correct itself. It never did. The people who suffered the most were not those behind the fraud, but those who believed that being honest would protect them within a dishonest setup. Psychology often describes this as optimism or avoidance of conflict. While partly true, this explanation is not enough. There is another aspect that is rarely talked about. Fairness is not just a moral principle. It is part of our identity. Experiments by Henri Tajfel in the 1970s showed that people quickly link their self-esteem to the norms of their group. When fairness is seen as who we are, giving it up feels like betraying ourselves. As a result, people put up with being manipulated longer than they accept the idea that they might need to change their own views. This is where the theory starts to fail. We would expect people to correct course faster based on rational self-interest. In reality, our identity slows this process down. I've seen this play out in company teams during reorganizations. Management announces that they will be transparent, share the sacrifices, and focus on a long-term vision. Employees respond with loyalty, extra hours, and patience. Months later, bonuses quietly go to those at the top, and layoffs affect those at the bottom. When questioned, managers blame market pressures, legal issues, or future benefits. These explanations sound reasonable, and that is where their power comes from. They take advantage of the psychological agreement. Workers feel frustrated, but also ashamed for feeling that way. They think, maybe I'm not seeing the whole picture. These doubts are not accidental. They come from believing that the situation is fair. A particularly disturbing study by behavioral economist Dan Ariely around 2008 showed that people cheat more when they can rationalize it as normal or harmless. But if you change your perspective, you see something worse. People who refuse to cheat assume that others will also hold back. They underestimate strategic dishonesty because they define themselves against it. Machiavelli suggested this centuries ago, but psychology tends to soften the idea. The honest person is not just good, they are predictable, and predictability can be used against them. From the inside, this does not feel like manipulation. It feels like confusion. It's like constantly lowering your expectations while trying to convince yourself that you are becoming more mature. Subordinates describe feeling a vague worry. Partners mention walking on eggshells, and employees talk about feeling slightly out of touch. They do not feel defeated, just outpaced. The unfair player moves first because they do not wait for permission for shared rules. The fair player waits for evidence that never fully arrives. This is especially risky because fairness does work in fair situations. Cooperative approaches do better than selfish ones in repeated interactions, as Robert Axelrod showed in the 1980s. That finding is often quoted. What is not discussed as much is the condition: repeated interaction with reliable consequences for bad behavior. If you remove the consequences, cloud the accountability, and introduce hierarchy, the situation changes. Even so, people carry the old rule into the situation, thinking the structure will protect them. It will not. The problem with fair play is not that it is useless. It's that it is seen as a neutral thing. It is not. In unbalanced situations, fairness signals how far others can push you before you resist. Once you send that signal, it's hard to take it back without penalty. The troubling question is not whether being fair is right or wrong. It is whether believing in fair play without knowing who enforces it is a strategic mistake. Once you understand that fairness will not protect you in an unfair situation, something uncomfortable follows. The conflict is no longer about who is in the right, but about who gets to define the situation. This is where the fight quietly shifts, not into actions, but into perceptions. I used to think this was just a metaphor. It is not. In most power struggles, perception is the first thing to be controlled. In the early 1970s, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman ran a set of framing studies that became famous. The same result, when described as either a gain or a loss, led to very different choices. People would take unreasonable risks to avoid a perceived loss, while avoiding safer options described as gains. This is often explained as a mental bias, a shortcut in thinking. But here's a less noticed detail. Participants did not feel tricked. They thought they were being logical. From their point of view, the decision made sense. That is what makes framing so dangerous. You do not feel pressured, you feel clear-headed. Corporate communication departments learned this faster than psychologists admitted. When British Petroleum rebranded itself as BP and started using terms related to sustainability in the early 2000s, their internal investment methods barely changed. However, employee surveys showed higher morale and stronger connection to leadership. Workers felt they were part of something progressive, even as cost-cutting got worse. The battle had already been won, not in budgets, but in how things were understood. Once perception was aligned, resistance faded. We rarely speak of this tactic directly. Classic social psychology suggests that perception is fragile and easily corrected by facts. Solomon Asch's studies on conformity in the 1950s showed otherwise. Participants gave obviously wrong answers about the length of lines simply because everyone else did. What struck me upon revisiting those studies was not just the conformity, but the interviews that followed. Many participants said they doubted their own senses. They did not think the group was lying. They thought they were mistaken. That is the quiet power of shared perception. It does not silence you. It makes you doubt yourself. You can see this happening in modern workplaces. During performance reviews at large advisory firms like McKinsey or Deloitte, employees are often told they are doing well, but not exceptionally. The wording is deliberate. In 2015, leaked internal documents showed that forced ranking systems were kept even when managers knew they skewed things. Employees described feeling constantly behind an unseen standard. They were not punished, just always feeling inadequate. The idea of underperforming became part of their thinking. People worked longer hours, not because of explicit orders, but because the narrative suggested they were always almost there. Current explanations describe this as motivation. Here the theory begins to waver. If the goal was motivation, clarity would work better than ambiguity. Yet ambiguity persists because it causes dependency. When you do not fully understand how you're being judged, You depend more on those who claim to know the full picture. That reliance feels like professionalism. In reality, it is control through perception. One of the best examples comes from Stanley Milgram's obedience studies in the 1960s. These are usually described as studies about authority. But consider the setup, the lab coat, the calm voice, the official setting. Participants were not forced. They were guided into a way of seeing things where resistance felt irrational. Many later said they believed the experimenter knew something they did not. Again, it was not fear but trust in the setup. I did not expect that detail to be so important. This is why power is rarely obvious. It works better when it seems like common sense. Elizabeth Holmes did not persuade investors at Theranos with facts. Later internal reports showed the technology barely worked. She instead sold a story of revolution, secrecy, and urgency. Employees who raised concerns described feeling like they were blocking progress rather than revealing wrongdoing. The feeling of being on the wrong side of history was more silencing than any non-disclosure agreement. For people within these systems, the experience is subtle. You start adjusting how you speak. You choose your words more carefully in meetings. You sense which interpretations are rewarded and which are quietly ignored. Over time, you stop thinking about truth and start thinking about what will be accepted. This change does not feel like manipulation. It feels like social intelligence. That is the trap. Popular psychology tells us that awareness is enough. Once you understand biases, you can correct them. I'm not so sure. Many leaders know these effects well and still fall for them when the setup supports their identity or eases their anxiety. Knowledge does not eliminate perception. It just adds a layer of explanation on top of it. The unsettling truth is that whoever controls perception does not need to control behavior directly. People will control themselves. They will predict expectations. They will fix errors before anyone asks. They will call it professionalism, loyalty, or realism. The question is not how to fight power head-on, but how many of our choices are already made before we think we are choosing. Once perception is already shaping reality, the next move is to target emotion. People rarely notice it at the time. They feel frustrated, anxious, or defensive, but they do not recognize that these feelings are being used. I did not expect that subtle triggers could override months of careful planning. Yet the evidence is everywhere. In 1961, Walter Mischel conducted the famous marshmallow studies at Stanford. Children were left alone with a marshmallow and promised a second one if they waited before eating the first. Years later, follow-up studies showed that self-control predicted success in school and social situations. The part that is rarely mentioned is how easily self-control fails under slight distraction. When a researcher moved objects on the table, the children gave in faster. Environment, small signs, even minor worry. These affected their ability to act in their long-term interest. Adults are no different. Even though they think their sophistication protects them, it is not. I saw this happen during a corporate negotiation in 2017. A manager at a technology firm was presenting budget cuts. The vice president interrupted repeatedly, using insults disguised as questions. "Are you sure you considered this? Did you even read the report?" Each comment seemed small. On tape, she seemed composed, but the minutes showed uncertainty, repeated clarifications, and a subtle loss of power. When I asked her later, she said she felt competent, yet she had doubled the report's errors. The point is that emotional trickery does not feel like trickery. It feels like your own mind failing. Daniel Goleman's work on emotional intelligence popularized the idea that awareness can protect you from manipulation. Here the theory falls short. Awareness helps if the trigger is clear. If it is part of the social tone, rhythm, or expectations, awareness is almost useless. In a 2016 review at a global company, employees described subtle undermining happening every day. Emails sent at stressful times, conflicting directions, sudden crises announced casually. People adjusted their behavior constantly, believing they were acting responsibly. The reality was that the emotional setup had already skewed decisions in predictable ways. What is remarkable, and rarely admitted, is how often peers participate, on purpose or without knowing it. In the 1980s, research on social undermining by Barbara Duffy and her colleagues showed that coworkers would subtly sabotage each other's efforts, often using humor or critique. Employees reported feeling frustrated, guilty, and self-doubt, and they blamed themselves for failing. I did not expect how easily a few strategically placed provocations could spread through a team, shaping how everyone behaved without anyone giving orders. This is the quiet power of emotional leverage. Consider tech startups in 2018. Founders used messaging apps not just to coordinate, but to create small anxieties, sending messages late at night, vague messages hinting at dissatisfaction, rapid escalations in group discussions. Junior staff reported sleepless nights, overwork, and constantly second-guessing themselves. No rule was broken. No explicit threat was made. Yet decisions aligned with the founder's preferences, often against the employee's better judgment. The lesson is harsh. Logic can survive analysis, but it rarely survives emotional interruption. Once your mind is hijacked, you respond instinctively, not strategically. Even management theory, with its focus on incentives, struggles to explain this. Incentives assume clear thought. Feedback assumes clarity. Both fall apart when emotions are used. The Harvard Business Review in 2012 discussed cases where leaders resisted cost-saving steps, only to change their minds after repeated, specific questions that made them feel inadequate. They reported acting out of principle, yet the reason was emotional, not rational. The appearance of choice hides what is really happening. From the point of view of those affected, the effect is disorienting. You start questioning your memory, judgment, and even moral standards. A single moment of frustration or doubt spreads, changing priorities, relationships, and performance. Those who design the setup rarely step in directly. They just create conditions that reliably cause predictable internal reactions. The situation seems fair until you notice your own freedom shrinking bit by bit. The disturbing thing is that once emotional hijacking is in play, the victim often regulates themselves. They anticipate the next trigger, adjust ahead of time, and try to fix mistakes in an attempt to regain control. Ironically, preparing becomes part of the trap. In any high-stakes interaction, I wonder how many of the choices I think are mine have already been influenced by unseen hands, and how many of those hands belong to people I would never suspect. Once emotion is already guiding action, the next step is almost unseen: withdrawal. Not a sudden blow, not a sharp word, but the deliberate retreat. I did not expect how much power could exist in what is not said, in the spaces between appearances. Silence, when used strategically, becomes more than just a pause. It becomes a signal, a tool, a subtle form of control. I first noticed this pattern in a series of negotiations in 2013 involving a European energy firm. The president would disappear for hours during tense discussions, refusing to answer messages or take calls. At first, colleagues thought he was avoiding things, was incompetent, or could not make decisions. By the third time, a pattern emerged. The teams waiting for direction began second-guessing themselves, revising proposals multiple times, and over-communicating to fill the void. The lack of clear direction created pressure far stronger than any instruction could. People acted not due to orders, but to anticipate what was expected and often tried too hard. Management writings tend to dismiss this as random or a failure to communicate. Yet in 1989, a study by Michael Argyle on nonverbal behavior in workplace hierarchies found that intentional silence increased perceived authority. Participants saw those who spoke less and observed more as more competent, even when their contributions were objectively smaller. What is rarely noted is that competence perception is linked to influence. People defer, adjust, and censor themselves around those who hold back. I found this surprising because the silence is not passive. It is action disguised as an action. The effect goes beyond meetings. In tech startups around 2016, founders who limited direct feedback and visibility in project work indirectly, or on purpose, shifted entire teams' priorities. Employees described anxiety, double-checking, and solving problems before being asked. Some felt tired, others felt excited. Both reactions led to the same result: alignment without explicit enforcement. Here, absence is more effective than presence. Presence can be challenged, argued with, resisted. Absence works like a quiet force. The pattern repeats even in social groups. Work on parenting in the 1990s, such as work by Diana Baumrind, suggested that the authoritative approach, high demand, high responsiveness, was best. But looking closely at stories and follow-ups, the children of parents who combined guidance with strategic silence often understood expectations faster. They self-regulated to avoid unseen results. Silence communicated limits and priorities more effectively than words ever could. I observed this pattern while consulting at a financial services firm in 2018. A partner intentionally delayed signing off on minor approvals, creating a small bottleneck. Analysts started prioritizing projects they thought would be approved, spending hours on reasons that were never requested. When a partner reappeared, the work was already aligned with unsaid standards. I was struck by how much effort was redirected by a simple pattern of absence, and how the team viewed silence as strategic guidance rather than holding things up. Current theory calls this letting subordinates take initiative or distributed responsibility. That is convenient, but it misses the key point. This tactic uses uncertainty, self-doubt, and the human inclination to fill spaces with expectations. The workforce feels independent, yet every adjustment simply improves someone else's control. What feels like freedom is contained within unspoken limits. The result is subtle, builds over time, and is rarely attributed to how things were arranged. From the inside, the experience is confusing. You plan, act, and predict with extreme care, but the standard for success keeps shifting. The absence itself dictates the pace and urgency. You feel responsible, but the rules of responsibility are unclear on purpose. It seems that the less someone appears to guide you, the more you follow their influence. What bothers me most is how easy this control can seem. There is no need for arguments or persuasion. People regulate themselves, predicting approval or disapproval that may never happen. I wonder how many workplaces, relationships, or social systems depend on this tactic, where influence travels through empty spaces and silence achieves more than speech ever could. Once silence and absence have reshaped behavior, the question shifts to reasons. At what point does outsmarting the situation feel necessary and morally correct? I did not expect how simply a few well-placed reasons could turn trickery into strategy, and strategy into self-respect. But the evidence appears everywhere, from boardrooms to experiments. Consider the classic Stanford prison experiment by Philip Zimbardo in 1971. Participants assigned as guards began restricting freedoms, embarrassing the prisoners, and creating new rules. Most reported feeling conflicted at first, but within days, they saw their actions as necessary or for order. What is less talked about is how fast the moral confusion sets in. The guards did not see themselves as cruel. They thought they were responsible. They outsmarted the situation and convinced themselves they were doing right. The idea is simple. Once you alter the setup, morals are adapted to it. I noticed a similar pattern in 2016 during a corporate restructuring at a global advisory firm. Junior managers were asked to implement layoffs, yet leadership described the task as an opportunity to streamline and protect high performers. Managers described feeling stress and guilt, yet their reasons, efficiency, loyalty to the firm, future opportunities, made the action bearable. One person commented, almost casually, that without framing it as protective action, they could not have acted at all. Justification does not come after the act. It arrives at the same time, a partner to strategic behavior. Behavioral economics also sheds light here. In 2005, Dan Ariely and his colleagues carried out experiments on cheating with reasons. Participants were more inclined to lie when they could explain it as harmless or socially acceptable. What is rarely acknowledged is the psychological cycle this creates. People who refuse to cheat are caught off guard by those who do, because the cheaters are confident and have moral reasons for their actions. The act itself is hardly seen under the confusion of justification. Those around them feel wronged, but the manipulator feels correct. The mismatch between what is seen and what is felt is extremely disorienting for observers. This is normal in startups and high-pressure firms. Presidents or project leads manipulate data, delay approvals, or selectively share facts, then describe their actions as mentorship, strategic foresight, or protection. Employees report both admiration and confusion. They see the manipulation but cannot disagree without going against the same reasons that legitimized it. This is the trap. Even the victim plays a role in the story. The effect is particularly strong when it builds over time. In 2014, a major technology company ran internal simulations to test decision-making under confusion. Teams given incomplete info, combined with stories about long-term benefit, made aggressive choices they later called prudent or visionary. Interviews revealed a unique detail. Participants knew the info was imperfect, but moral and professional framing made them rethink risk as necessity. The line between cunning and compromise is gone. The mind can justify almost anything if the setup allows it. Even in small social groups, this concept works. During volunteer campaigns I observed in 2012, leaders manipulated scheduling and task visibility to favor certain participants. Those selected often felt guilt, but explained it as deserved. Those passed over had explanations for failure as temporary. Everyone outsmarted the environment. Everyone lived in some state of moral confusion, and no one fully saw the subtle control the leaders held. From the point of view of those participating, the experience is unclear. You believe your choices are logical, but the logic comes from the stories others make. You act strategically, but the strategy comes from the environment itself. The more you navigate the confusion, the more you depend on it, and the more it shapes your sense of right and wrong. It is unsettling that moral confusion does not require force. It works quietly, convincing the competent and ethical that their shrewdness is right. Once justification is internalized, the question is no longer whether to play the game, but whether the game has already chosen who counts as right. Not realizing the structure could decide which side wins before people even make their choices. I did not expect this illusion to be so convincing. How people act as if they are free while the design quietly guides them. Consider the structure of large corporations in the early 2000s. I observed one financial firm where promotion, project placement, and awards were all managed through metrics, peer review systems, and intentional openness. Employees believed they were in charge of their own careers. Internal reviews revealed that algorithms and leadership ensured predictable results. Top people funneled into relevant projects, average people into support roles, and those who disagreed were brushed aside. Everyone felt they had a choice, but the options were structured. What struck me is how normal this felt. Employees did not resist because the system had made obedience feel like strategy, not duty. Research provides a parallel. In 1972, Lawton and Darley studied the bystander effect, showing that the presence of others reduced a person's sense of responsibility and delayed their action. Participants felt free to act. In fact, social architecture had limited their choices. Society works almost the same way as organizational behavior. Freedom exists, but the scope is defined by perception, expectation, and carefully created information. There is no duress needed. The system shapes choice even before the person can decide. I did not expect this subtlety to be so common. Tech startups provide modern examples. In 2017, a company structured product development so that junior engineers decided priorities, allocated efforts, and set deadlines. Each decision felt like freedom, but the order of information, performance indicators, and mentoring influenced outcomes toward the president's plan. The team felt creative while perfectly following an already made strategy. This is where strategic influence goes unseen. The system translates initiative into predictable obedience. Even social and political situations act the same. During movements in 2011, researchers noted that participants believed they were shaping the protest through consent, yet media framing, logistics, and leaders funneled activity into patterns which upheld narratives. The system does not require pressure and shapes decision beforehand. The more members believe in freedom, the extra they reproduce the system structure. From the angle of average employees, this structure feels logical and equitable. What is forgotten is that the mechanisms that shape perception also produce compliance. It is influence as the environment, much more than the command. I witnessed deal making in which both sides made a deal thinking that all options were on the table. But data framing before negotiating certified that each offer was aligned with the main goal of all parties. Systematically, that made both parties unknowingly agree with predetermined options to secure both parties' final deal. The insight is that mastering the structure requires not just skill, but a desire to have it. The people inside feel agency. This leads to the illusion of a framework that creates the model on perception and behavior. The question remains on how the structure could lead you astray and how to identify it beforehand, before it is too late.